Hey there, I'm Greg Nystrom. What I've got pictured on the board is a drawing of the menorah, the Jewish menorah. Those were the oil lamps or the candlesticks that could be found in the ancient Jewish temples when they were in existence. It had 7 branches. That's what I have between the green lines. Outside the green lines, I've got an extra 2 branches. That is a picture of the Hanukkah menorah. But this is also a very important pattern, biblically speaking, and it's going to be important to the time that we are living in. And I'll get to that in a minute. So in another couple videos, I went over the 7 feasts, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just briefly mention what they are: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Tabernacles. The 2 extra feasts, Purim and Hanukkah, the 2 rabbinical feasts. On the Western calendar that goes from January to December, Purim would come before the 7 feasts, and Hanukkah would come after. Something before a 7 and after a 7, 2 extra things. That's a pattern. We see it here with the feasts. Okay, another place we find this, the book of Zechariah. Zechariah 4:3. Zechariah has a vision of the menorah, but he sees 2 olive trees, one on each side of the 7-branch menorah. Olive trees have branches, they have golden pipes, the oil is flowing, right? Okay, I did another video on that, so I'm not going to go into detail. That's called the number 8, part 2, the anointed ones. So if you're interested in that, please go and watch that. I would go in more detail. But I said in that video, it's a picture of several things. One, it's a picture of the 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation, because in the book of Revelation, they're called the 2 olive trees or the 2 candlesticks. It's also a picture of the governor at the time and the high priest at the time, the political leader and the high priest at the time. This is also a picture of Jesus, because Jesus is the last high priest ever, and he is the King of Kings. So he is the last political authority there's going to be as well. So the 2 olive trees in Zechariah ultimately point to Jesus. Again, if you want to see that in more detail, watch the number 8, part 2 of my videos. Okay. So, all right. So now I want to talk about the 7 days of creation and the 7,000 years that there's going to be of human history. We're on a 7,000-year timeline. We're about at 6,000 years. Now, if you have a hard time believing that because of science, because science says it's 4 billion years old, the Earth is, please watch my previous video. The whole reason I did that was a setup to this video so I could deal with that issue and get it out of the way. And in that video, I pointed out how the Earth could be 4 billion years old on the one hand and still be 6,000 years old in another way. So please watch it if you're not sure about that, because God is very clear about this timeline. And one of the ways that he shows us that this is true is that it matches the 7 days of creation. For example, on the 7th day of creation, God rested. The 7th millennium, the 7th period of 1,000 years, will be the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ, the millennial kingdom of peace and rest. When everything is better and everything is great because Jesus is back and he's ruling over the world. There'll be no war for 1,000 years. That's why the book of Revelation says Jesus comes back and rules for a literal 1,000 years. Now, many people are in churches and denominations that are amillennial. They don't believe that. Amillennial. They don't believe in a literal millennium. They think the 1,000 years is going on right now in heaven, and it's not a literal 1,000 years. That is not true. I am sorry. That is just wrong. And one of the ways we know that is that this 1,000 years matches the 7th day. The 7th millennium matches the 7th day. Rest on this day, rest on that day. Another way we know is that the sun was made on day 4 of creation. This corresponds to the 4th millennium, 3,000 to 4,000 years from creation. It just happens to be the period that Jesus was born in. He was born at the very end of it, ushered in the 5th day, or the 5th millennium. Okay? And we can show that. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about Jesus being before the 7,000-year timeline and then after the 7,000-year timeline. The Gospel of John clearly says that Jesus was with God in the beginning and is God. He existed before this earthly timeline, before the passage of days and hours and minutes and years. started happening. Jesus existed. He is God. He was with God in the beginning because he is God. He's God the Son. The Gospel of John also says that all creation was made through Jesus, conduit through which God would interact with his creations, I should say. And ultimately, Jesus is the mediator between God and man. He reconciles us back to God because he died for our sins. Okay? So Jesus was there in the beginning. The Gospel of John also says Jesus was the light of the world. On day 1 of creation, we have light. Let there be light. So we can associate Jesus with day 0 before creation and day 1 of creation, right? So he's associated before the 7,000 years and the beginning of the 7,000 years. He is the Alpha. He's also the Omega. He comes back on the 7th day to set up his kingdom, right? Set up his kingdom. And then the 8th day, the 8th millennium, is not a millennium at all. It is eternity. And I pointed this out in other videos, but right, the number 8 on its side is similar to an infinity. That's the 8th day. Now think about this. The 8th day of creation was the first day of the 2nd week of the next week. Okay? Jesus rose from the dead on the 1st day of the week. It would have been the 8th day if you kept counting the week. 7th day, the 8th day. But the 8th day becomes the 1st day. That's going to be important when we talk about that later, right? But he is associated then with this 8th day, the 7th and the 8th day. Both are Jesus. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning. Before there was timeline, before there was any time, he existed. After earthly time is gone, because after the 7,000 years, there's a new heaven and a new earth, according to the book of Revelation. And there's no sun, because God and the Lamb, namely Jesus, are its sun. Okay? Or the light, I should say, is the light. There's no more sun. There's no more earth revolving around the sun. There's no more earthly time as we understand it. It's a 7,000-year timeline. Jesus also comes in the middle of the 7,000-year timeline. He was born. He was incarnate. He was born. He was put into the timeline. See, he's outside the timeline here, and he's outside the timeline here, but here he now directly involves himself in the timeline by being born a child and growing up, becoming a man, right? And Jesus was born what is the equivalent of the 4th millennium from creation. The 4th millennium would have been 3,000 to 4,000 years from creation, or from Adam. That is when Jesus was born. He came at the very end, towards 4,000 years, and I'll show you that in a minute. And at the end of his life, then we're going to start, right, the next day, the 5th day, the 5th millennium. And it will be 7 millennium total. Okay? But Jesus before, Jesus after. Can you see? It matches, right, the extra branches on the menorah. It matches the extra feasts on the end. It matches the extra olive trees. Pattern 1, 2, 3, 4. Keeps getting repeated. This is just the way God proves this is true, by having it match a pattern. All right, so let's talk about Jesus being born and then growing up and being a man. There's this idea that there would be 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham. All right, so we know for a fact that there was about 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham. I'm just going to abbreviate his name. 0 to about 2,000 years. How do we know that? We have the ages that the fathers, how old they were when they fathered the children in the book of Genesis, and you can add up the years. Now there's a discrepancy. There's actually 2 different ways to look at it, but both of them come out to about a 2,000 year period, right? From Adam to Abraham, right? So we have 0 to 2,000 years, right? And the next idea is that there's 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus, right? 2,000 to here. I'm going to put it over here. Right? Abraham to Jesus. So that's a total of 4,000 years. Then It's going to be 2,000 years from Jesus till his return, 6,000 years. Okay, that's the second coming. All right? 2,000, 2,000, 2,000. Now it's very interesting, the Jewish sages, some of the rabbis who came after Jesus, and obviously they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah, and yet they viewed this days, these 7 days, being like 1,000 years for each day. They had scripture to back it up. Psalm 90 says a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. We Christians have the New Testament where the Apostle Peter, in one of his letters, reiterated this position. A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. That is another clue that this is correct, the 7,000-year timeline. 1,000 years for each day of creation. It matches up. Okay, but these Jewish rabbis, these sages, agreed with this idea, and they broke this up into 3 sections, this 6,000-year period. The first one was basically a period of chaos. Then came law, and then came what they call the Messianic age. All right. Now the law corresponds to 2,000 to 4,000 from creation, and it was during the middle of this time that the law was given to Moses. Okay? Then they're looking for the last 2,000-year period. They call it the Messianic age, and they believe the Messiah has to come somewhere in here, maybe at the end of the 6,000 years, and then he comes back for the 7th day, the 7,000 year. Now, they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But their Messianic age corresponds perfectly to the first coming of Jesus and the second coming, that 2,000-year period. Okay? We would call it the church age. We call it the church age. Now, their calendar says year 5782. They're off by a couple hundred years, but I'm not going to take the time to go in why they're off by a couple hundred years. Okay. But we know that. Okay. But you see how this corresponds. If Jesus was born just short of 4,000 years, it would correspond with day 4 of creation, which is the sun, also Pentecost. Now that's very interesting. Do you know why? Because this Messianic age, we call it, what did I say, the church age. We call it the church age. And the reason we call it the church age, the church was born on what feast? Pentecost. The Pentecost after a few days, only 9 or 10 days, after Jesus was taken up to heaven after his resurrection. That Pentecost, the same year that Jesus was raised from the dead, that was the birth of the church. That was the new thing, right? The church age. The age that the Messiah, Jesus, ushered in. He ushered it in. He's the one that planted that seed, planted the seed with the apostles, and then the church began with the 3,000 at Pentecost. He plants a seed, and what do you do when you plant a seed? You wait for it to harvest, and then you come back and you harvest it. And the 7th feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, is called the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of the Harvest, or the fall harvest. That is what's going on. Also very interesting. The feasts some of them are based on the cycles of the moon, because that's what the Jewish calendar. Passover is a full moon feast. Tabernacle's a full moon feast, okay? Pentecost, 49 days after first fruits, or 7 weeks after first fruits, which is very close to Passover, just after Passover. In the year that Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, and they had that Pentecost, it would have been around the 5th or 6th day of the 3rd month. We can calculate that, because you know it's 7 weeks after the day he was raised from the dead. Why is that important? Because the 5th or 6th of the month, the moon would have been about a third full. You see, Jesus comes 2/3 of the 6,000, right? 4,000 over 6,000 is 2 over 3. He comes 2/3 of the way. He was born just before 2/3 of the way, but At the end of his life, it's 2/3 of the way, and this is when the church age begins. The church is born, and so the church age is going to be the last third of this 6,000 years, and the moon was about 1/3 full on that Pentecost. And you see it. This also ties in with another thing, and I've talked about this in other videos, but I'll repeat it for you. All right? This idea, okay? I'm just going to erase this stuff. Again, the idea of 2/3, right? Jesus comes 2/3 of the way now. 2/3 as a decimal is 0.666, right? That's the mark of the beast. I went over this in the number 33, part 1, the last part of the video, right? 2/3, how humanity, we get stuck at 2/3 of the way. It's associated with Satan taking 1/3 of the angels, 1/3 of the light from heaven. Well, it's like he took 1/3 of our light as well because of original sin. And we get stuck. And we need Jesus to take us the whole way. So he comes 2/3 of the way through, and then he comes back for the last third to make us whole. It's about, Jesus said he came back to seek and save what was lost. To make us whole, to make us complete. Make us born again, to make us anew and whole. No longer divided between our sinful nature and our good nature, which that's what happens with original sin. We're a divided person, and we're not complete, and we're divided against ourselves. Jesus makes us whole if you believe in Jesus, right? So it makes sense he comes 2/3 of the way and then returns after the last third of the way of the 6,000 years. This is all very important for for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is, guess what? This is the time we're living in. We know Jesus was alive 2,000 years ago. We know that Pentecost happened in the same year that he was raised from the dead. We know that's probably somewhere between 30 to 33 AD. We are in this time of the last 2,000 years, of the 6,000 years before the second coming of Jesus. Okay? Can it be a little bit past or less than 2,000 years? Only God knows exactly how it times out. But we know it's going to be about 2,000 years from the birth of the church to the return of Jesus. And we are living in that time. 2,000 years ago, Jesus was an adult. He was in his 20s and he was walking around on this planet. Now, you can't convince people of that. You can't convince most Christians. Most Christians aren't in churches or denominations that even discuss the end times. They never even discuss it in general. And they're certainly not going to talk about Jesus is coming soon and we're living in the time of it. The only problem is that's exactly true. It's 100% true. God is very clear about this timeline. And we can figure it out. We know Jesus has been almost 2,000 years since Jesus was raised from the dead and that the church began on that Pentecost. We know it. Another thing I want to talk to you about, right? We talked about Jesus being the light. On day 1, God said, let there be light. Then on day 4, the sun is created. Then Jesus returns on day 7. So he is the light that returns, right? He's the light of the world. 1st, 4th, and 7th. This balance, we have this balance here, all right? And it's also a picture of the menorah. All right. This balance. In the feast is very interesting. There were 3 feasts that it was decreed that the Israelites all had to go to Jerusalem. There was 3 feasts. Can you guess which 3 feasts? It was the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th. The 1st, the 4th, and the 7th. The light was the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th. Jesus is associated with the 1st, the 4th, into the 5th, and the 7th. Jesus is also associated before creation and then eternity. So the 1st and 4th of the 7,000 years and the 7 days, but also the 2 extra things before and after those 7, fitting the pattern that we have shown here. All right? This is a pattern of the menorah. Even look at this. All of these feasts are in the 1st month and have to do with his first coming, his death and resurrection. All these feasts are in the 7th month, exactly half a year apart, have to do with his return. Again, I did videos on that. I'm not going to go into detail. The balance here, and it's a picture of the menorah, but that also fits the 7 days, and it fits the 7,000 years. So we know the 7,000 years is true. And we know we're about 6,000 years, and we know Jesus returns about 6,000 years, which means he is coming to this current generation. People alive right here, right now, will experience these things. There's not some unborn generation in the future. Try to convince people of that. Good luck to me. I am trying. Good luck to me.